The handcuffs weren't real. That's what I kept telling myself as two police officers walked through the reception hall doors during my father's toast, while 200 guests turned to watch, while my new husband's hand went cold in mine. My father set down his champagne glass so carefully, like a man performing a task he'd rehearsed. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved, the way you feel when a long wait finally ends. And my sister, sitting at the family table in the blue dress I'd paid for, wouldn't lift her eyes from her plate. My name is Rachel Kilburn, and 3 months before that afternoon, I would have told you my sister Denise was the person who understood me best in the world. We'd shared a bedroom for 14 years in a small house outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, whispering after lights out about the boys we liked, and the mother who worked doubles at the hospital, and the father who believed love was best expressed through discipline and silence. Denise was 2 years older, and when our parents fought, she was the one who'd climb into my bed and tell me it wasn't about us. When I got my first real job at 22, I sent her money without being asked, because that's what you did for family, because that's what she'd done for me. So when the officers stopped in front of my table, not my father's, mine, and asked if I was Rachel Kilburn, I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, confused sound, because surely this was a mistake. Surely someone had the wrong wedding, the wrong bride, the wrong life. Ma'am, we've had a report of narcotics distribution associated with this address, and this individual, the older officer said, not unkindly. We need you to come with us. David, my husband of 40 minutes, stood so fast his chair fell backward. This is insane. She's a physical therapist. She works at Mercy General. Sir, please step back. I remember looking past the officer's shoulder at my father, searching his face for the outrage a father should feel when strangers accuse his daughter in the middle of her own wedding. Instead, I found calm. Instead, I found a man watching a plan complete itself. And that was the moment the questions started, the ones that would keep me awake for months afterward. How long had my father known? Who had told him? And why did my sister already seem to know exactly what was happening before it happened? They didn't arrest me that day, not exactly. They separated me from my guests, walked me to a side room off the banquet hall, and explained that an anonymous tip had come into a county tip line 3 weeks earlier, alleging that I was using my physical therapy practice to distribute prescription opioids to patients, that I'd been doing it for over a year, that there was a storage unit under my name with product. They had a warrant for that storage unit. They wanted to know if I'd come voluntarily to answer questions once the search was complete, or if they needed to compel me. I had a storage unit. That part was true. I'd rented it 8 months earlier to hold wedding decorations and my grandmother's china, things too fragile for our small apartment. I gave them the address without hesitation, because innocent people don't think to be afraid of the truth. That's a mistake I would not make again. David wanted to cancel the honeymoon immediately, wanted to hire a lawyer that night, but I told him no, let's wait, let's see what they find, because I still believed in the stupid, trusting way people believe when they've never been betrayed by their own blood. That this would resolve itself in a day, an apology, a clerical error, someone else's Rachel Kilburn in some other county. It took 4 days for the detective to call. His name was Sergeant Alan Ferris, a tired-sounding man with a Pittsburgh accent, and what he told me on that call rearranged everything I understood about my family. The storage unit had product in it. Not decorations. Not china. 43 bottles of oxycodone and hydrocodone, still in pharmacy packaging, along with a ledger, handwritten, listing names and dollar amounts. Someone had used my name, my unit, my rented storage space to build what looked, on paper, like a real operation. Do you have any idea who else has access to that unit, Ms. Kilburn? Ferris asked. And I sat on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and thought about the day I'd rented it. I thought about how, 3 weeks after signing the lease, my sister had asked to borrow my car for an afternoon because hers was in the shop, and how I'd given her my keys without a second thought, because that's what you did for family, and how my extra storage key had been on that same ring. I didn't say any of that to Ferris. Something in me, some old animal caution, told me to keep it to myself until I understood more. "I'll need to think about that," I said, and he told me to think fast, because whoever did this had also been careful enough to buy a burner phone using a prepaid card traceable to a gas station 11 miles from my sister's house. He didn't know that detail meant anything to me yet. Neither did I, not fully. But it was the first thread, and I held on to it. My father had stopped speaking to me the week before the wedding. Not stopped, exactly, that makes it sound sudden. He'd grown distant over about 6 weeks, canceling a dinner, giving short answers on the phone, and when I asked Denise if she knew what was going on, she'd sighed and said, "You know, Dad. He gets in his moods." I believed her. I always believed her. That was the architecture of my whole life, believing Denise, because she'd earned it, or because I thought she had, back when we were girls sharing a room and a father who loved us both, but had never learned how to say it gently. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that 6 weeks before my wedding, my father had received a phone call. Not from the police. From Denise. She'd told him, in the careful, worried voice of a daughter forced to reveal something terrible, that she'd found things in my apartment during a visit, pills that didn't belong to me, cash in an envelope, a phone I kept separate from my regular one. She told him she didn't want to believe it either, but she was scared for me, scared David was marrying someone he didn't really know, and she didn't know what to do, and could he please talk to me before the wedding, try to get me help. My father, a man who had spent 30 years as a union electrician distrusting easy explanations and soft lies, chose to believe her completely. Because Denise had never given him a reason not to. Denise was the daughter who stayed close, who called every Sunday, who'd moved back to Scranton after her divorce, and helped him with doctor's appointments after his heart attack 2 years earlier. I was the daughter who'd left for college and stayed gone, who visited on holidays, who'd built a life 90 minutes away that didn't orbit around him. In his mind, though he never said this to me outright until much later, Denise's devotion had bought her credibility, and my independence had cost me mine. He didn't come to me because, in his mind, addicts lie. He'd learned that lesson from his own brother, my Uncle Pete, who'd spent a decade lying to everyone who loved him before he died of an overdose in a motel outside Allentown when I was 19. My father had promised himself, standing at that funeral, that he would never again let a family member's charm and denials stop him from acting. So when Denise came to him with tears and worry, he didn't see a woman fabricating a crisis. He saw himself finally learning from the past. He called the tip line himself, using a payphone at a truck stop so it couldn't be traced to him, because he told himself he was protecting me from a worse fall later, that a scare now, a real consequence, might save my life the way nothing had saved his brother's. He believed, truly believed, he was doing the loving thing. That's what made it so hard to hate him cleanly, later, when I understood. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew, in the weeks after the wedding, was that my father had gone cold, my sister was suddenly unreachable whenever I called, twice sending me straight to voicemail and once, humiliatingly, texting back, in a meeting, talk later, and that somewhere. Someone had built a fake criminal history for me using a storage unit I'd only ever used 4 times. David believed me instantly, completely, without needing to be convinced, and I remember crying harder over that than over almost anything else, because I realized how rare it was. How I'd spent 30 years assuming that kind of belief from family and had apparently been wrong. We hired a lawyer, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Anand who specialized in exactly this kind of mess, fraud and identity misuse cases that intersected with criminal allegations. Her first instruction was simple: stop talking to your family until we understand what happened. Her second instruction was harder: get me everything, every text, every email, every receipt, every access log you can find, because someone set this up over time, and time leaves a trail. That was when I remembered the storage facility had cameras. It took Priya 2 weeks and 1 subpoena to get the footage, because the facility manager wasn't willing to hand it over informally. When it arrived, I watched it alone first, in my own kitchen, because I needed to see it before anyone else's reaction shaped how I felt about it. There was Denise, on a Tuesday afternoon 8 months earlier, using my spare key, letting herself into Unit 214, carrying 2 duffel bags in, and leaving 40 minutes later without them. She came back 3 more times over the following months. Once with a man I didn't recognize, tall, thin, nervous energy in the way he kept checking over his shoulder. Priya ran the plate on the car he arrived in. It came back registered to a Marcus Waldo, and a record search showed Marcus had 2 prior arrests, one for possession, one for distribution. Both charges eventually pled down. I called Denise's ex-husband, Todd, someone I hadn't spoken to since their divorce 2 years earlier, on a hunch I could barely explain to myself. Todd had never liked me much, thought I judged Denise too easily, but when I asked if the name Marcus Waldo meant anything to him, he went quiet for a long moment. "That's her guy," he said finally. "Before we split." I thought she cut him off. "You're telling me she didn't?" The picture that had been forming in blurred pieces suddenly sharpened into something almost unbearable to look at directly. Denise wasn't protecting anyone by lying to our father. Denise was in trouble, real trouble, money owed to real people, and somewhere in the last year she had decided that the safest way to protect herself was to make sure that if anything was ever traced back to that storage unit, it would land on someone else's name. My name. Her sister, the one person who'd never once, in 30 years, given her a reason to think she'd fight back. I sat with that for 3 days before I told David, and even longer before I told Priya the full shape of my suspicion, because some part of me kept hoping I was wrong. Kept hoping there was a version of this where Denise had made one bad decision under pressure rather than a slow, calculated plan to sacrifice me. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the ledger. Once a forensic accountant Priya brought in matched the handwriting against 6 years of birthday cards Denise had sent me. Cards I still had in a shoebox because I was sentimental in exactly the way that had made me easy to use. What Denise hadn't planned for was my father's phone call to the tip line. She'd wanted him worried, wanted him to confront me quietly, maybe even wanted me to panic and do something that looked suspicious. She hadn't expected him to go to the police himself, hadn't expected an actual search warrant, hadn't expected the machinery of an investigation to start moving with a momentum she couldn't control. Denise had built a trap for a private family crisis and instead triggered a criminal case, one now generating its own evidence, its own subpoenas, its own inevitability. I confronted her once, before any of it became official, because some stubborn part of me needed to hear her deny it to my face, needed to see whether 30 years of shared history would produce even a flicker of hesitation. I drove to her apartment on a Thursday evening and stood on her step and asked her, plainly, without accusation in my voice, whether she'd used my storage unit for anything other than what I thought. She looked at me for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes, calculation, maybe, or the last flicker of a person deciding whether honesty was still an option. Then she said, "Why would you even ask me that? Dad's the one who called the police, Rachel, not me. Maybe you should be asking why he doesn't trust you instead of coming after me." It was such a precise redirection, such a practiced deflection, that I understood in that instant she'd already rehearsed this conversation in her head, maybe more than once. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of her, though I wanted to. I said, "Okay," and left, and in the car outside I finally let myself feel the full weight of it, the particular grief of realizing that someone who shared your childhood had, at some point without your knowledge, started treating you as a resource instead of a sister. The investigation took another 5 months. Detective Ferris, once shown the footage and the financial trail Priya's team assembled, reopened the case with a different target. Denise was interviewed twice. The second time, faced with the footage, the plate matched to Marcus and phone records placing her near the storage facility at times that lined up with deposits into an account under a name that turned out to be a shell she'd set up. She stopped denying and started negotiating. Marcus was arrested separately in a wider operation the county had already been building a case against, unconnected to me except through her. My father called me the week the charges against Denise were formally filed. It was the first time we'd spoken in almost 6 months. His voice sounded older than I remembered, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I need you to know I didn't want this," he said. "I thought I was protecting you." "You believed her over me without even asking me a single question," I said, and I made myself say it plainly, without shouting, because Priya had taught me that quiet words land harder than loud ones. "You called the police on your own daughter because you were scared of losing me the way you lost Pete. But you never once picked up the phone and asked me directly." There was a long silence, and I let it sit there, because for once I wasn't going to fill it for him. "I know," he finally said. "I've had a lot of time to think about why I did that. About Pete. About how scared I still am about it, even now." "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not." I told him I needed time before I could figure out what our relationship would look like going forward, and to his credit, he didn't perform wounded feelings the way he might have years earlier. He simply said he understood, and that he'd wait as long as it took, and that he was sorry, plainly, without qualification, in a way I hadn't expected from a man who rarely apologized for anything. The formal charges against me were dropped entirely once the investigation redirected, and Priya helped me file for expungement of even the initial report so it wouldn't shadow any background check for the rest of my life. But the thing I hadn't expected, the thing nobody warns you about in stories like this, was how anticlimactic the actual legal resolution felt compared to the private reckoning that came with it. I didn't feel triumphant watching Denise's case move through the system. I mostly felt tired and sad and strange, the way you feel standing in a house you grew up in after it's been sold to strangers. Denise eventually took a plea deal, cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence, given that she'd been more instrument than architect of the larger operation Marcus had been running, more a scared, indebted woman making increasingly desperate choices than a hardened criminal. I didn't attend her sentencing. I sent David instead, because I needed the information but couldn't bear to sit in that room and watch her face when the judge spoke. He told me afterward that she cried, that she looked smaller than he remembered, that she never once looked toward where our father was sitting. My father did attend every session, sitting in the back row, and when I asked him why, he said, "Because she's still my daughter, and so are you, and I don't get to only show up for the one who didn't hurt me." It was the first time I understood that his loyalty to me and his grief over Denise weren't actually in competition, that a father could hold both without either one canceling the other out, even if it had taken this much damage for him to learn how. David and I rebuilt what should have been our honeymoon 8 months late, a quiet week on the Maine coast instead of the trip we'd originally planned, and there was something fitting about starting our marriage late and small instead of large and public, given everything the public version had cost us. I remember standing on a dock at sunset that week and realizing that the wedding day I'd spent months imagining, the one interrupted by officers walking through a banquet hall, had actually given me something true underneath all the humiliation, proof, immediate and undeniable, of exactly who would stand beside me when everything fell apart, and exactly who wouldn't. My father and I speak now, carefully most weeks, rebuilding something that will never again be as unquestioning as it once was, but is maybe more honest for that. He asks me real questions now instead of assuming answers. I've learned to answer them instead of assuming he already understands. Denise wrote me a letter from the facility where she's serving out the remainder of her sentence, 18 months, most of it already behind her. I haven't answered it yet. I read it once, sitting alone in the room that used to be our shared childhood bedroom back when I stayed at Dad's for a weekend, the room where she used to climb into my bed after our parents fought and tell me it wasn't about us. In the letter she said she was sorry, that she never thought it would go as far as it did, that she'd told herself for months it was a temporary problem she'd fix before anyone got hurt. I believe she's sorry. I'm just not sure yet whether sorry is the same thing as trustworthy, and I've decided I'm allowed to take as long as I need to find out. Some nights I still think about that champagne glass, the way my father set it down so carefully, like a man completing a task he'd rehearsed, and I understand now that what looked like betrayal that day was really fear wearing betrayal's clothes. But I also think about Denise, sitting at that table in the blue dress I paid for, unable to lift her eyes from her plate, and I understand that some fear doesn't excuse itself so easily. Family, it turns out, isn't the people who never hurt you. It's the people who stay in the room after the truth comes out and are honest enough to ask what happens now.